Can you folks see the slides? I hear somebody eating lunch. All right, I'm a little perplexed as to why it doesn't seem people are able. Hello?
Hi, I heard you, and then
Yeah, I don't know. All right, so let's just plow ahead. Kayla, if you're out there, I'm not sure that the other folks are able to unmute themselves so well, but I hope that they can. We'll see how this goes. Intrepid explorers of new technology. All right, so Paul O'Neill and Jamie Fernand from the firm of Barton Gilman wanting to talk about navigating student discipline during COVID-19 and all of the craziness that it imposes. So we are going to talk about, first we're going to talk about some policy considerations, then we're going to talk about discipline basics, not too much on that, and then we'll try and explore how it plays out in the COVID environment of remote or hybrid instruction. If folks have something that they want to say and weigh in, please do. Jamie's got access to the chat for the Whova. I believe it works, but then again, I also thought you could talk, so maybe that's wrong. I'm hoping that you can weigh in and say what you want to say as we go along. If people have things to add, that makes the presentation better. So so let's see what this looks like. We only have about an hour here, so here we go. We wanted to actually start with a hypothetical that we don't want to run through until the end. So you see the clever thing here is we're going to hit you with it, and then you can sort of keep it in the back of your mind percolating while we go. And then once we've covered all the material, that's when we'll actually drill down and try and unpack the hypothetical. So Jamie, I think we agreed you would run through it.
Sure. So as Paul said, I'm gonna read the hypothetical. We're gonna talk about the different laws as we go forward, and at the very end or towards the end, there's a number of different things within this, kind of like a law school exam, just things embedded in things that we've been dealing with, and hope some of you may already be dealing with these things in a COVID discipline. So I'll read it now. Lemon Valley Charter School class is operating in a hybrid mode of instruction. Mrs. Einstein, the teacher, is having issues with 3 of the students in her 8th grade class. There are 2 boys, Malik and Oliver, that have been continually interrupting the teacher during remote instruction. Malik is a student with an IEP, and he keeps leaving the screen and disrupting instruction. So that's one person we'll flag. Oliver is seen on the screen texting on his phone, and it appears he is looking up answers during an exam. The teacher sent an email to Oliver's mother to explain that phones were not permitted during remote instruction. But Oliver's mother did not help the situation and appeared on screen with Oliver the next day and yelled at the teacher. She keeps doing that, appearing on screen. Totally unrelated, a girl in the class, Nina, has been harassing another classmate through Instagram posts, group text chains, and TikTok. So as you'll see, there's a number of different scenarios embedded within that. And obviously the question is, what should Mrs. Einstein, the teacher, and Lemon Valley Charter School do in these situations? So just something to think about and marinate in your head while we're going through the different slide deck.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that at the end. All right, so here we go.
Before we get into everything, obviously, when we talk about discipline, we generally talk about exclusionary methods of discipline. So we want to just be mindful and keep in mind the value of limiting its impact. Exclusionary discipline could have some real consequences. Discipline that keeps students from the classroom is generally discipline that we refer to exclusionary, because the student is no longer able to participate in the class in the same manner or in a meaningful manner as other peers in the class. And the practice of doing that can result in, it has been shown to increase juvenile delinquency, delayed graduation, and low grades. It sometimes perpetuates the problem so that the students have because they feel isolated from the classroom. And young students, especially who are expelled or suspended, are as much as 10 times more likely to drop out of high school. That's according to like the 2014 study. Something that charter schools should be mindful of, something that sometimes I'm sure you've dealt with, and sometimes some parent advocacy groups will send letters or talk through disciplinary measures that charter schools take to try to reduce the amount of exclusionary discipline measures that are taken. I think that's all I have on that.
African American students lost 66 days of instruction compared to just 14 days for white students.
Yes.
Right, Jamie.
African American students lost 66 days of instruction compared to just 14 days for white students for out of school suspension.
Right, right. That there was a study in 2015 that demonstrated that, and then indicated that kids with disabilities lost 44 days of instruction, which is double the loss experienced by their non-disabled peers. The point of this obviously being that exclusionary discipline can have a disparate impact on particular groups of kids, these two groups in particular. All right.
So when we're talking about all of these, we should think about a couple of different policy considerations in making policies and also in implementing the different practices of discipline. So the basic overall question is, what are we trying to accomplish through disciplinary measures? Obviously, we are trying to get the students to abide by the code of conduct, engage in meaningful instruction, and have a collaborative environment. And when you have different disciplinary measures, schools should take a step back and try to figure out how well they work. And one of the things that they should look at, and whether or not how they work, is whether or not they're disproportionately excluding certain categories of kids. Those were in the slides before, but there obviously are a number of different categories of kids that they could exclude in different ways. So it's something that you should be mindful of, schools should be mindful of as they go through the school year and take a gauge of whether or not the different disciplinary measures are impacting one group of children more than another, and why that might be and how they can improve that. That's why we talk about whether or not there can be productive adjustments to that. If you can see that a group of students is being disciplined at a higher rate, or some particular infractions are occurring with one particular subset of students, the school has a responsibility to try to look inward and try to figure out why that is and what they could do besides just disciplining students with expulsion or a long-term suspension. We'll talk about how special education status impacts discipline, as I'm sure everyone or many of you know that it has a huge impact on discipline, what disciplinary measures the school should take, and what's the process that the school takes for students that are either have an IEP or a 504 plan, or potentially could be eligible for those services. And again, maximize positive outcomes for students in the school.
Again, getting some feedback here. If folks could mute their line while we're going here. Okay. All right, and now I am unmuted. All right, so I'll run through this. So we do not want to spend a great deal of time talking about the nuts and bolts and basics of discipline, because we want to focus on how it plays out in a COVID context. But I think that we need to establish the baseline. The baseline, building on what Jamie was saying before, is discipline takes kids out of class. Taking kids out of class is a deprivation. It's not just that it has a disparate impact on certain groups of kids, but it also, you have a right under every state's constitution, including the New York State Constitution, to get an education. And so if you're keeping a kid out of school, there is a tension there. And the US Constitution says due process is essential, and that's an element of this as well. So we have to make sure that the discipline that we provide is both fair and proportionate. All right, so the world's really fastest ever tour of the law that would impact a student discipline in a charter school in New York. I'll go through these. You can get these slides. If this is something that you want to know more about and it isn't second nature to you, which I'm sure is true for some of the folks on this call, you can go back and drill down on this more than I'm going to do right now. But I'll quickly go through it. So we talk about different levels of the law that apply. Federal, state, authorizer. You may have a little local in there depending on whether you're dealing with special education in New York because you're part of the district LEA for special ed. But federal law, we talk about that. That's if we think of this as like a target, the outer ring is federal law. That applies to everybody. That's the US Constitution. That's statutory and regulatory requirements. Then we go to state. The most important thing, next ring in, is the New York Charter Schools Act. And the New York Charter Schools Act is going to tell you what other state law applies. Things like the Dignity Act, which protects against bullying. We've got compulsory education law, which requires kids to go to school. Health and safety and civil rights and testing and a whole range of other things apply to some extent in a particular way in charter schools. And your charter agreement and the charter law are going to take account of those things. Then you've got authorizer requirements. When we get it further into the target, you've got authorizer requirements which could be represented in the charter agreement, but also may go beyond the charter agreement. We have to be aware of those. And then there's the contract itself. There's the charter contract that you signed binds you in a whole bunch of different ways for discipline and a whole lot of other things. So that's kind of the universe when we look at the authorities. If we drill down a little bit, when we think about discipline specifically, we mentioned before, 14th Amendment of the Constitution is a due process protection and very, very relevant in a disciplinary context. When we talk about federal statutory law and regulatory law, quickly we get to the laws that relate to students with disabilities because those are gonna push in. The IDEA and Section 504. And we've got on the state level, the New York Charter Schools Act does address discipline to a limited degree, very limited degree. And then what you look to for the meatiest rules are the rules you establish yourself in your code of conduct. In order to get a charter in New York, you have to submit a disciplinary code as part of your charter application. And when that charter application is approved, my position is you are now authorized to implement that code and probably nothing else. I used to be the general counsel of the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, and my position when I was there was, that's what we said you could do. So if you're going to make a big change, if you're going to suddenly switch to a restorative justice model from some other model, you need to run that by your authorizer. Also, we look to protocols that you would have probably in your code of conduct or somewhere else that talk about what process you use for a hearing, what process you use for an appeal from that hearing. And the final thing on here says Education Law 3214. We could talk for a whole session on whether 3214 applies to charter schools. It's never been found, to my knowledge, by a court or any of the authorizers to apply, but it is a rule for district schools, and it has all kinds of requirements and thresholds and rules that would impose a uniform system that, in my opinion, doesn't apply and would conflict with many people's code of conduct. But if you ever have a challenge from an advocacy organization, they're almost certainly going to cite 3214 and say, well, that you have violated 3214 in the way you're going. You should just know that from a charter school perspective, that's usually not applicable. This would be a great time to say that we are lawyers, but we are not giving this information as lawyers. We are probably the lawyers for some of the schools on here, but this is not legal advice. This is just some nice people talking about 3214. Got it? Excellent. All right. So what do you got to do? Very, very basic. You have to respect due process. You have to give people due process even when it's a short-term suspension. And that may just mean saying you have been confronted with the charges, you had a chance to respond to them. If you are suspended for less than 10 days, that's what's going to kick in. If it's more than 10 days, you're going to have to do more, because due process is not a fixed concept. It is relevant, as it's relative to the deprivation. So the more deprivation, the longer you're going to keep a kid out of school. If it's going to be a long one as opposed to, a day, you get more process and you get things like the right to counsel, the right to put on evidence and challenge evidence, put on witnesses, challenge witnesses, to have a record of the proceedings and to have an appeal. So all of that is the baseline. This is happening with or without COVID. Jamie mentioned before special ed. Special ed is always a consideration. Basically, the concept is we don't want to punish students for behavior that they can't control. So in a similar long-term, short-term distinction, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, if it's more than 10 days, if it's 10 days or more, we treat it as something that requires a manifestation determination from the LEA. That means the CSE in New York. So if this was New Jersey or Pennsylvania or a lot of other states where the charter school was directly in charge of special education was the LEA, you would do these yourself. But in New York, you don't. You have to work with the local district, CSE. It is important to know, because I'm going to say something about this later when we get to COVID. We would expect that people are going to work through having a behavioral analysis done and a behavioral intervention plan done, because we can't always solve the challenging behavior that's going on, and simply suspending a kid doesn't make it go away. So keep in mind that we have tools that we use to try and improve the circumstances and not just to have consequences for that. I'm not even going to go through this. This is what happens when you are taken out of class in an interim alternative setting because of dangerousness. And that's a very high standard. It's not just a small thing. It has to be something like risk of death, extreme physical pain, disfigurement. But that's an element that's in the background determining consequences for kids with disabilities. So there we go. Look at that. I found this blue blob to put into the slides here, which seems, I don't know, somehow it reminds me of COVID. So we want to. Sorry?
Usually the COVID images are red.
Yeah, but they didn't have red. So picture that as being red. All right, so we want to switch. We want to pivot here. We've got the background. Those are the rules. That's the environment that we're in. How does it play out when we get to COVID?
So a lot of schools have been trying to tackle how do we discipline in a COVID setting, whether or not that means a hybrid situation, a remote situation, in person, that might end up going to remote. And through the spring and through the summer, schools have come to us with problems that have arisen that they weren't prepared for. Things like Zoom bombing, I think that's the right term for it. And students who are on their electronic devices while they're in remote settings, and what do they do? And one of the things we ask them, which we generally ask when a situation arises in a normal school setting, is what does your policy say? What does your code of conduct say? But no one prepared for this. I mean, and there's so many different ways of how COVID has impacted the world. Putting together a remote code of conduct or putting something in your handbook that actually says it's not okay for you to be texting on your device in your home while you're on the screen was not something that was contemplated by schools or teachers or anybody. So some of the pushback that we've gotten or that schools anticipated getting is that when they tell somebody that they're not allowed to do something, they often say, well, where does it say that? And where does it say that? And if I do that, what happens? So we've been working to revise people's handbooks, and we're still revising people's handbooks because things are continually coming up that we didn't anticipate. Similar to the hypothetical that we put on there, and I'd like to hear from you if you have other things that when we get to a slide later on the common problems that we're seeing that we weren't used to before. If there are other things that you want to share, that would be helpful as well. But I put on this slide a couple of things that I try to put into the remote code of conduct, either having an addendum to the normal code of conduct, or has this, a separate expectations that you could either have the parents sign or just give the parents and the students notification of what the kind of conduct is expected of them. So just put it over here. Arriving to class prepared and focused. And what I mean by that is that the students are signing in when they're supposed to be signing in, just like they would arrive at instructor at the same time the class starts. If it's a math class, have the math class out, math book out, have your pencil out, have your calculator out. Don't spend time during the class to try to figure out what class you're supposed to be at. Obviously, this is an easier task for older students, middle school and high school students. Younger students, might need assistance, but something to just think about. Minimize distractions, because when you're on a remote setting, everyone is seeing what you're doing. Generally, I've found that teachers like to have all students have the camera on so that they keep them engaged and know that they're paying attention, and then they're actually taking attendance. In order to take attendance, they actually generally need to, unless unusual circumstances warrant otherwise, the camera to be on. So the teacher could see who's paying attention and make sure that they're getting eye contact. Not bringing your device in the bathroom. That's definitely not something that was in the old code of conduct, because why would your computer device ever be in the bathroom? But it's something that unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just worth pointing out. Kids don't know that that's not appropriate, and it's something to just be mindful of. If you need to go to the bathroom, mute yourself. Obviously, depending on the level of instruction and the age groups of the students, you write this out a little bit differently, and the teacher explains it a little differently. Dress code I have on there. Some schools will still want their students to come in uniform or just be appropriate, not showing your belly or having a ripped shirt. Some schools do not care about that, but that's just something to put in there if that's important to your culture. And culture obviously still exists even in a remote or hybrid setting. Being an active participant in the class and being focused and remaining attentive are pretty straightforward. Avoid plagiarism and cheating. That's something that I think that we're getting more questions about, and people are paying a little bit more attention to, because I don't think that all students or even parents really understand what plagiarism and cheating means, either in an online setting or generally. And going to Wikipedia or another entry and just cutting and pasting an entry and handing it in as your homework to many schools is considered plagiarism, unless, of course, it's work that needs to be cited and sourced, and that's the assignment. So I think it's educating your students and your parents and memorializing that in a way that people understand this is not what's expected. And cheating is Googling. Cheating is asking your older brother who's in the next room who did geometry before what the answer is, making sure that the students who are taking the exams are actually the students that are in the class. And that's obviously a harder thing to do in a remote environment. When you're in class, it would be very unlikely that somebody would be able to cheat on an exam, but it's a much more slippery slope when you're not able to see the students necessarily taking the exam. And finally, at least on this slide, no recording. And what I mean by that is no video recording, no audio recording. You run into a host of privacy considerations when you're dealing with recording. Some schools separately would notify parents that they might be recording lessons for instructional purposes, but that's veering a little bit off that subject. Those are some questions we're getting from schools, but no recording other students and then sharing that, embarrassing them for whatever reason, or just sharing those images on social media, or even just texting with your friends would be inappropriate. So
just to be clear on that, Jamie's saying no recording by the students, which is different than saying that the school would record for whatever instructional purposes for their own.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been getting questions on both ends about that, but we're focusing this presentation on the students' conduct and conduct that's not appropriate. And I consider recording students or the teachers during instruction to be inappropriate from the students' recording devices. So there we get to what are the consequences for violations.
Yeah, and just to keep it on this screen for a second. So Jamie said this at the outset, but if your code of conduct doesn't cover things like this that relate to the environment, when something happens and you want to say, hey, stop that, because you have to have something to say, but you also have to have a level of consequence assigned to that thing. And it may be that the violation of the dress code is a minor thing, but it may be that plagiarism is a pretty big thing. And so, you need to paper it up and revise your materials so that that's very clear. You don't want to be in a situation where you're making this up as you go. Okay. So as she was saying, so what are the categories of things that happen? She mentioned Zoom bombing. There's a whole bunch of them here. Why don't we run through them one at a time? I give some thought to how that might play out and what the consequences might be. Zoom bombing is a phrase to me that means somebody's getting into the screen and disrupting the instructional environment. And that could happen from a student in the class. That could happen from a student who's not supposed to be in that class and is doing it in another class. Obviously, could happen in all kinds of external ways, in ways that suggest that some third party is doing some very, very disruptive things. But in a disciplinary context, we think that there should be limitations. You should call it out and say, this is a violation. This is a new category, if you will, of ways that the school's code can be violated. And this is what we think we're doing about it. Maybe you're going to get a day's suspension. Maybe you're going to get more. Maybe you're going to treat it in a restorative justice way if that's the policy that your school has. But I think that you should consider addressing it. Jamie mentioned recording sessions. I won't go into that again. Cyberbullying. I mean, wow. In some respects, you might expect that being remote means that you have less of an opportunity for students to do things that get them in trouble, right? Because the students aren't next to each other and they're not getting into physical fights. There are fewer concerns about sexually aggressive behavior and other pretty serious things that can happen. But if there was ever a platform that led to more cyberbullying, going completely remote seems to be it. And so I think we would be interested to know, maybe we can have some input in a little while about whether you're seeing much of this. But certainly, I think the expectation would be that your code should already have cyberbullying as a category of prohibited behavior. But you may want to revisit it and make sure that it's A, there, and B, strong enough, because this could be a really devastating thing if the remote instruction or hybrid instruction is leading to more of what can be a very serious issue. Cyberbullying would be a violation of the bullying laws and a very serious violation. So I'll just pause there. Jamie, you want to throw in on that or should I keep going?
No, you keep going.
All right, so she mentioned plagiarism, she mentioned cheating, both things that may already be in your disciplinary code. If they are, my guess is that they have probably not been invoked as much as they potentially could be now when all of the work is being done remotely. Finally, on this screen, unsafe behavior. Well, this, by the way, gets back to when we are in the building. So on the element of the COVID educational experience where kids are in the building, whether it's hybrid or if you've gone fully back to that mode. Unsafe behavior while kids are in the building, meaning not respecting the social distancing and health practices that you put in place. This obviously is a serious problem, not necessarily one that you are ready for or expecting when you go back if you're not back yet. So that's something that I think you really need to call out in your code and make sure that kids are educated on it and the teachers are educated on it, that we've got, it doesn't do you much good to have protocols of distancing and wearing masks and cleaning your hands if kids aren't doing it, or in some way roughhousing in ways that really create a problem there. And you might want a more serious consequence for that than perhaps that kind of roughhousing might have gotten you in a less fraught, less health conscious environment.
Right. One other thing I just wanted to mention for challenging behavior wouldn't be addressed in the code of conduct, but should probably be added to your handbook, is parents during this remote or hybrid instruction. A lot of schools have issues with what they sometimes be challenging behavior from parents. Some schools have mentioned over the course of years that we've been working with them that parents' behavior is actually what's causing them the most headaches. Either parents that are acting inappropriately, cursing, coming to the school, yelling at the two teachers or the students. But now we're seeing, and what we usually have advised is to have a section in your handbook that talks about what visitor behavior is expected and what visitor behavior is not tolerated and what kind of consequences come when visitors, including parents, do not behave appropriately on school grounds or on school premises or doing a school activity. So I think that the same rules would apply, a school activity being an instructional class, even though that it's within the confines of their homes. But I think that there should be some particular mention to parents or in the handbook on who is allowed to be in the screen, what is expected, and to try to make sure that the atmosphere and the climate for instruction is conducive for all. So just something to flag.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll keep going. All right, so how do things actually play out? How does it work for you to try and deal with disciplinary matters while you're dealing with COVID? And the first question, of course, is, well, I don't know, are you virtual? Are you fully virtual? Or are you hybrid? If you're hybrid, meaning that you're back in the building some of the time, everybody's back in the building some of the time, then maybe you can, deal with your disciplinary issues like suspensions and whatnot, and other kinds of practices. Maybe the fact that you can be in the building helps you to carry those out. But certainly remote investigation of incidents and potential violations of the school's rules is something that people have to think about if they are not there full time. And I think that takes some planning. It takes some adaptation of the existing protocols and making them online. Now, I'm talking as if that's not already happening. I'm sure that in your schools, those of you who are running schools, you've already had to deal with this because there are certainly lots of ways that kids could be violating rules, and the previous slide showed a bunch of them. So let's just talk about the different elements of that. Holding virtual hearings is something that, you may have done that in the past already in a circumstance where that was necessary for one reason or another. People couldn't access the school, but you have to give some thought to, okay, so what is the process here? How are we going to carry that out? How are we going to, to begin with, how are we going to investigate matters? How are we going to look into whether a child was cheating, to look into whether there's cyberbullying? How are we going to do that? I would say that the general rule of thumb here is stick with your code of conduct, stick with your practices and policies, and find a way to tweak them. You're not inventing something entirely new. So if your dean of culture is the person who investigates potential disciplinary violations, or if your assistant principal or whoever it might be, that should probably stay with that person, and their process would be a little different because they're not showing up in the school building. They are not coming up to people in person and handing them a form to fill out about what they saw when there was a particular incident. But that stuff should translate fairly well to online and electronic usage. Use of footage is another interesting idea. It might be that if you are recording instruction, then you have some footage of children acting up and of disciplinary violations. So you would have to find a way to capture that and to utilize that in a way that turns it into the kind of evidence chunk that you can use as part of a virtual hearing. You would have to make sure, as you think about the virtual hearing, can everybody hear each other? Do we have the logistics right? Do the parents have the ability to weigh in if they want to? Can you call witnesses? Do you have a way to do that? Do you have a way to deal with side meetings if those need to happen? Is there a way to pull out of the full meeting so that the parents and their counsel, let's say, can talk to each other? Or are you going to have that be a completely separate thing, and they're going to connect offline? Whatever it is, you have to give it thought. And as I was saying before, the time to give it thought is not when you have to go and deal with an incident. The time to deal with it is in advance. Come up with your process.
Right.
Go ahead.
We found that when schools try to figure out the process as an incident occurs, that we've gotten pushback from the parents of the student who's either accused or people that are presenting evidence that says that, you know, the school's kind of just making it up on the spot. People like to see how long until a hearing is going to take place. Where is the hearing going to take place? What the process is. And sometimes, and now, because we're going to be doing this in a virtual setting, if you are doing it in a virtual setting, and some schools might not. Some schools might be able to hold the hearings in person, but some people might be able to participate by camera if they want to. It is important, though, that you're able to see everybody and that everybody's able to ask questions from each other. You might want to split it up into either more than one chunks of time, as Paul said, that you might want to have a ability for breakouts to talk to your counsel, or doing part of the hearing in one day and a part of the hearing in another day. It doesn't have to be everything at once because we have the luxury of breaking it out. But I would give yourself the flexibility in your policies so you're able to point back on that language.
Yep. So I want to get into the rest of this slide, but I want to ask Jamie, can you see the Q&A or the chat? And are there any questions in there? And if there aren't, if anybody or even if there are, if anybody has any questions that you would like us to talk about or that you would like to talk about, throw something in there and we will factor that in. We'll keep going now, but then we'll swing back to it.
I do, unless I'm missing it. The Zoom group chat I have, but I don't see any questions.
Well, the Zoom chat, I think, is not the chat that.
I know, but I signed on through Huvo, I think it's called. So I think I would see.
Yeah, somebody throw something in the chat in the Hoover thing so that Jamie can see as sort of a test. All right, I'm going to keep going here.
Paul, I hate to interrupt. I just sent you the questions that are in Hoover's Q&A in our private chat in Zoom. That way you guys have them.
All right, Jamie, can you access that?
I'll send it to Jamie.
Yeah, send it to Jamie if you would. All right,
Okay.
so the bulk of the rest of this slide is, in some respects, to my mind, the big question mark of this whole presentation, which is, what does suspension mean? What does suspension mean for when kids are online? And it's an interesting concept. Does that mean that you are suspended from being in the live synchronous stream of the classroom? Does that mean that the punishment is that you are in a non-synchronous participation in this? Is that something that's going to resonate with a child who's receiving that punishment? Is that something that you think adequately allows them to progress in their work? I mean, ordinarily we send kids home if they're suspended for 4 days, or they're suspended for 10 days. When we do that, I mean, there's a decent chance that they're just going to watch TV. You know, maybe they're not really disincentivized to do that negative behavior because you're basically giving them a day off. Now, I don't know if we have a different standard for that in a virtual environment, but I do think it's worth thinking about what can we do that's fair, that doesn't result in them not having access to the information that they need, but that also is a disincentive. And how do we categorize it? Now, I really would be interested if there are folks on the call who are in schools who are implementing disciplinary consequences for online behavior. If you wanted to share with us some of what it is you're doing, I think we would love to have that as be part of this conversation. So maybe do that as we are talking here. But just this notion of lack of access to the live stream as suspension, I think is worth thinking about. But I think it's also worth thinking about the notion of restorative justice in an online format. And that almost certainly isn't part of anybody's restorative justice policy in their code of conduct, if you have that kind of an approach. But I really think it makes for an interesting, kind of compelling idea that is there something that somebody can do for the folks online? Is there something that they can do in their community that they can bring back and talk about? Or, you know, I don't know, I'm just brainstorming here, or do some kind of a project that they present online or whatever it may be. It's an odd environment to try and deal with discipline. It raises more questions than we have answers. But I do think that it creates opportunities to perhaps do something that that's useful. Jamie, anybody toss in any good ideas?
I can say something. The problem is I can't write it in the chat. So is
Oh,
it
no,
okay
no,
if I
I'd rather you talk. By the way, thank you for saying that. Please just talk.
Okay.
I'd rather not have the chat.
So one of the things that we have at our school is interesting is we do community service as a part of our restorative justice. So they'll go to the cafeteria in our food program, which is kind of a local non-Cisco food program that we pull from local resources. And they'll help clean up the kitchen or sweep it up if they have an issue of disruption in the class or something like that. And we feel like it's a good way for them to give back. So what I'll do is they know that already as a cultural expectation. So communicate to the families if there's been an online issue and say, hey, is there community service or something they can do in the home? And a lot of times parents think that's hilarious. The kids think it's hilarious, and they find a way to do something in their home that is similar to what they're used to in the school with the community service component.
Great.
Interesting.
That's terrific. Thank you. Anybody else? All right.
We do have some questions, Paul.
All right, let's do some of those.
Okay, two questions. One, I think we're going to cover in the HIPAA, which is what are some strategies to deal with a student that consistently interrupts class? And I think we're going to cover that a little bit in the hypo. And the second is, can we in fact ask students to have their cameras on during instruction? And my response to that question is that you can and you should require students to have the cameras on during instruction with some caveats, which I'll go into. I would have that as I said, as in the remote code of conduct policy, I would have that be an instruction that's in writing, that all students should have their cameras on so that the teacher is able to appropriately take attendance, make sure that the class is engaged, make sure that the class is attentive, that the right person is actually there. There might be some circumstances where students will not have their cameras on, where there's a privacy situation, where a student has a custody issue, where very unique circumstances. Sometimes it could be a student with an IEP for a very specific reason that the student's not going to be on camera, but the vast majority of cases, you could ask students to have their cameras on during instruction.
Okay. Any other
Those
ones?
are all the questions we got so far. Does anybody have anything else they want to throw out there or share?
Why don't we keep going and we'll see if it stirs anything up. All right, so let's talk about special education during COVID. Not a ton. First of all, let me talk about it in general, and then we'll talk about it from the disciplinary perspective. When March came along and the circumstances of schools closing first happened, the U.S. Department of Education came out with 3 helpful rounds of guidance, non-regulatory guidance, addressing various issues, and some of them related to special education and instruction during COVID. And their position that they took was basically, if you're going to provide instruction, then you have to provide special education. You have to do IEPs, you have to do 504 plans, you have to do all that stuff. And you have to provide a free appropriate public education, which is what you're supposed to be entitled to. More recently, February 28th, actually, not February 28th, September 28th, they came out with 2 documents, one relating to the IDEA, one relating to Section 504, basically reaffirming all of that and saying that while before in our guidance, it was okay for you to sort of push services and supports that were difficult to provide during remote instruction, push them till the point in the future when it'll be easier to do them because we'll be back in school. The new guidance really emphasizes you really have to find a way to do it. You really have to not kick the can down the road indefinitely. You really have to find a way to provide all these services. And so I would say that can impact student discipline because we are now providing all the full range, hopefully the full range of services to the extent that we can. There may still be a tiny portion of services that simply can't be provided to kids who have particularly profound disabilities or evaluations that can't be done that aren't in person. But look to the federal guidance and look to the state guidance. About a week ago, the State Department of Education put out another document relating to special education, the Q&A document, and rules about that. That would impact charter schools and other schools in the state. please take a look to all that stuff. And some of it, crosses over into issues that would relate to discipline. But the basic plan for all of it is to, on a disciplinary level and instructional level, to adapt what you're doing, working collaboratively with parents to figure out on a student by student basis what will work. Now, a lot of students who have IEPs or 504 plans also have behavioral challenges. And so how we can adapt those behavioral plans and support these children in the virtual setting or even in the hybrid setting is a crucial piece, and is really something that you need to be focused on. But when we ask the question, can you suspend a student with disabilities who breaks school rules for online instruction? I think that's worth consideration. And I think the answer to this, yes. But it takes me back to what we were saying before about start with your existing set of rules. Start with your code of conduct. What in particular does it say in your code of conduct about discipline of students with disabilities? That is not something that you have a lot of flexibility with. The federal code, the federal statute, and most importantly, the regulations are really restrictive about what it is you're supposed to do. That is still the standard. Now, creativity is important, and adapting it with parents is important. But keep in mind that that's still there. You may be needing to provide alternative instruction. This gets us back to the question before, what is a disciplinary measure? What is a suspension? If you're basically saying, well, it's going to be non-synchronous, you're going to get the same support, but not within the active classroom, maybe that is something that's going to happen here. What are the consequences that you can impose? You're going to look to what your code of conduct normally would do, and you're going to adapt it, hopefully through the adaptations that you have made to your code of conduct for remote learning. And that's what we were talking about in the early part of this session. One further consideration for kids with disabilities is a manifestation determination review. As I think we all know, a kid who is suspended beyond for 10 days or more requires a determination about whether there's a link between the disability and the problem behavior before you can suspend that child further. Because this is New York and not all those other states where the charter school is primarily responsible for special education process, you need to work with the CSE. In a hybrid environment, I think it's going to vary a lot depending on where you are in the state as to exactly how those CSEs are operating right now. So you're going to have to factor in, what does the CSE do and how do we access that? I would be interested to know if there's anybody on this call who's had a situation where you're dealing with a CSE and trying to get an MDR done for a virtual environment violation. But what I'm worried about is that there may be some schools out there that are more lax than they need to be about following these rules because it's more difficult in the hybrid environment. It would put you at risk. First of all, it's not what the kid is entitled to, and it's not what's supposed to happen under the law, but it also puts the school at some risk if in retrospect, when there's a review of how you've operated, you haven't been careful about special education protections, particularly with regard to manifestation determinations and suspending children from the hybrid instruction. All right. I think we're going to move back into the, one more note before we get back into the hypothetical. One more note, and this is in the guidance from September 28th from the US Department of Education, just that there are some students with disabilities who, because of their circumstances, can't really wear a mask. So if you have hybrid instruction or in-person instruction where you are having kids there in the building and you're trying to stay careful and distanced and healthy, there may be kids in your environment who simply can't follow the same rules as everybody else, the way that is played out for other people. And there's two factors about that. One, be aware of that. You may have to be creative about distancing and how you are configuring where people are so that you don't exclude those children. And two, do not suspend those children because they haven't, you may have taken our advice and changed your disciplinary code so that you now have a provision about remote learning or about hybrid learning and said, hey, you have to keep these, a failure to stay safe is a punishable offense. It better not be a punishable offense for a kid who has a disability that precludes them from being able to do that. All right. So having done that, I think if I can count slides, we are back. Woohoo, we are back at our massive hypothetical. So how about this time I'll read it and then we will run through it. We've sort of broken it out with colors. It's a big block, but we're going to break it down. All right, Lemon Valley Charter School, its class is operating in a hybrid model of instruction. Mrs. Einstein is having issues with 3 of her students in their 8th grade class. There are 2 boys, Malik and Oliver, that have continually disrupting the teacher during remote instruction. Malik is a student with an IEP and he keeps leaving the screen and disrupting instruction. Oliver is seen, could be Olivier, I guess. Oliver is seen on the screen texting on his phone, and it appears that he's looking up answers during an exam. The teacher sent an email to Oliver's mother to explain that phones were not permitted during remote instruction, but Oliver's mother did not help the situation and appeared on screen with Oliver the next day and yelled at the teacher. She keeps doing that. Unrelated, a girl in the class, Nina, has been harassing another classmate through Instagram posts, group text chains, and TikTok. I don't know what TikTok is, but Jamie included that because she has a young daughter who said we should include it. So what do we do? All right, so we're going to break it down. Is it realistic to think that we could get some folks who are on the line here to give us their input about what we do about Malik? What do you say? Come on, we're all doing this together. Anybody want to tackle this?
I think you're on your own.
I'm on my own. Okay.
We also have a 5-minute warning, so.
All right. So Malik has an IEP, right? That sets off that warning bell. Keeps leaving the screen, disrupting instruction. Well, why is he leaving the scene and disrupting instruction? I need to know more about that IEP. Is that a behavioral IEP? Does it have a behavioral element to it? Is this a child who needs support in order to be in that room? Is he supposed to be receiving a paraprofessional who would work with him and try and address some of the behavioral issues that might keep him from participating in instruction? Is the school providing that? I mentioned before, I'm a little worried that schools are in some cases being a little lax here because they're trying so hard to just exist that the special ed rules may not be being followed. So before I discipline this child, I'm going to have to ask a lot of questions about, is the school doing right by that child before I'm going to impose any consequences on that child. But if they are disrupting instruction, we would go through the same kind of process that we would with a code of conduct with anybody else. There may be consequences for that. Maybe they're progressive consequences. If we get to a threshold where this child is being suspended, then we may get an MDR in there. But I think the main thing to point out is, in a situation like this, be careful before you leap to the conclusion that everything is there that should be there to support that child. And then be careful, as you would with any kid who has an IEP, about making sure that you're disciplining that child in response to the law. All right, Jamie, why don't you do the next one? And that is this.
Okay, it's a 2-part scenario. The first one we'll get into. Oliver is seen on the screen texting on his phone, looking up answers during the exam. So those are 2 different things. Both of which would hopefully be captured in your new remote code of conduct or added. I would think that there's a couple of different infractions there. Being on an electronic device, or sometimes it is appropriate to be on a device, but the teacher should instruct students when they're supposed to be on those devices. So being on the device during class is probably a violation. And then the second point of it is looking up answers during an exam. That would be cheating. So needs to make it clear to students that when you're doing an exam, unless instructed otherwise, that the answers can't come from Google or from any other electronic means. So I think for that situation, I think that you'd go through your normal disciplinary process, and it would be age specific and school specific exactly what that would be. But those two separate violations there. Utilizing an electronic device during instruction is one, and looking up answers during an exam would be a second one, especially if it's repeated. The second part of that scenario is the dealing with the challenging parents. That is, to use the same words as challenge. The teacher sent an email to Olivia's mother to explain that phones are not permitted during remote instruction. But not only did she not listen, but then she came on to the instruction and disrupted the class more. The simplest thing to do would be to mute Oliver's ability to participate in the class, thereby muting the mother's ability to interrupt the class. But you can't punish the child for actions of their parents. That becomes difficult when they're conflated. So if you were to mute Oliver's parents, then you'd be muting Oliver. If you would disengage his camera, then you would also be limiting Oliver's ability to participate in instruction. So it is very difficult, and trying to figure out a way to talk with a parent, to engage the parent. Sometimes it requires a letter from us. Sometimes it's a scary letter from the lawyers that kind of get the parents in check. Or try to take it seriously. Sometimes it's just the parent isn't being heard, and you just need to have somebody else talking with that parent to hopefully make that go away. We're now on our 2-minute warning, so we have to get to the last one.
Yeah, but I want to throw in something about that, the last part. So
Okay.
Oliver's mother may not, what you might do is say, well, we're going to shift her to a breakout room so we can talk to her. But again, now you've taken Oliver out of the room. So be careful about that. And there's a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor in Detroit. I did a Google search for this, who's making an argument that disrupting a public meeting is a violation of federal online. I don't even remember exactly what the law was, but basically rules about violating internet safety. And so they're making an argument that schools are public meetings in a sense, and that to force yourself into an online school environment could be essentially putting yourself at risk for violating federal law. I don't think it's been implemented by any court yet. I throw it out there, not as legal advice, but I put it out there as people are starting to think creatively about this. All right, so next one.
And the last one, since we literally have no time left, this is would be a violation under cyberbullying, would be a violation probably under any other bullying statute. It would probably be a violation again also under DASA. The school would have a responsibility to investigate that. Obviously, what investigate means is going to differ because we're under a COVID situation, but then go through your normal situation and how whether or not this would move to a long-term suspension or expulsion or restorative justice process. Just think about in advance how exactly you're going to be able to implement that in a virtual setting. So sorry for running through that at the end, but there was a lot in there. Hopefully this was somewhat valuable. There's our contact information. I'm Jamie. That's Paul.
Woohoo! Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.